A trail camera in the Florida Panhandle caught something that made a room full of wildlife biologists go completely silent. A 13-foot Burmese python, one of the largest invasive predators on the planet, lying dead in the underbrush with its head torn off. Not hit by a car. Not poisoned. Killed. And when the researchers rewound the footage to see what did it, they didn't find an alligator or a panther. They found a bobcat. 25 pounds of muscle and fur taking down an animal 5 times its length. Scientists called it a first. And it happened right around the same time the state of Florida had just announced a plan the entire internet mocked without mercy, releasing thousands of snakes into the wild on purpose to fight an invasion of other snakes. People compared it to the mongoose disaster in Hawaii. They said Florida had officially lost its mind. But almost nobody laughing actually understood what they were looking at. Because this wasn't a new gamble. It was something coming home. And what's happened in the swamp since then is stranger, and more hopeful, than anyone expected. To understand why that idea sounded so absurd, you have to understand just how badly Florida had been losing this fight for the better part of 3 decades. The Everglades used to be one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth, a slow-moving sheet of water sliding across the bottom of the state, feeding alligators, wading birds, bobcats, deer, and panthers in a web that had been tuning itself for thousands of years. Economists have tried to put a number on what that ecosystem is worth, and the figure usually cited is somewhere north of $30 billion a year once you count flood control, fisheries, tourism, and drinking water for millions of people. This wasn't just scenery. It was infrastructure built out of grass and mud and living things. Then, in August of 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida, as one of the most powerful storms in American history. Somewhere in the wreckage, a reptile breeding facility was destroyed, and an unknown number of Burmese pythons, snakes native to the humid jungles of Southeast Asia, escaped into the surrounding wilderness. Nobody was counting snakes that week. There were homes to rebuild and lives to save. But the storm was only part of the story, because the exotic pet trade had already been quietly seeding the swamp for years. A baby Burmese python is small, cheap, and easy to fall in love with. It also doesn't stay small. Owners who ended up with a 12-foot animal that ate rabbits whole often made the same decision: drive to the edge of the wetlands and let it go, telling themselves it would be happier in the wild. It turned out to be more than happy. South Florida is almost a perfect stand-in for the python's native range: same heat, same humidity, same tangle of vegetation to hide in, except this new home came stocked with prey animals that had never once evolved a defense against a predator like this. Nothing in the Everglades knew to fear a python. Nothing new to run. And because pythons are ambush hunters built for stillness and camouflage, their spread wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, patient, and almost entirely invisible. A single female can lay close to 100 eggs in a clutch, curling around them for weeks to keep them warm, before vanishing back into the grass. Multiply that across a growing population with no natural predators, and you get a curve that no removal program on Earth could realistically keep pace with. For years, nobody had solid proof of how much damage was actually happening, because you cannot easily count an animal you cannot see. But researchers had one clever workaround: nighttime road surveys, decades of biologists driving the park roads after dark and counting the eyes that shone back in their headlights. Raccoons at the water's edge. Opossums crossing the asphalt. Bobcats slipping into the tree line. For years those drives turned up steady, predictable numbers. Then, sometime in the 2000s, the eyes started disappearing. When scientists eventually compared the old data to the new, the results were staggering. Raccoon sightings had collapsed by more than 99%. Opossum sightings fell by almost as much. Bobcat sightings dropped by roughly 87%. In some study areas, marsh rabbits couldn't be found at all, not reduced, simply gone. White-tailed deer, animals most people assumed were too large to be at serious risk, vanished from large stretches of the survey routes. These weren't the numbers of a struggling population. They were the numbers of a localized extinction event unfolding in near-total silence. Florida did not sit on its hands. Since 2013, the state has run an annual public hunting competition called the Florida Python Challenge, drawing hundreds of participants from across the country who wade into the marsh with headlamps and hooks hoping for cash prizes. In 2024, 857 registered hunters spent 10 days combing the wetlands and came away with 195 pythons total. Impressive as a spectacle. Almost meaningless against a population researchers estimate runs somewhere between 100,000 and possibly higher. Beyond the public hunts, the state and its partners have hired professional contractors who track pythons full-time, deployed drones with thermal cameras, trained detector dogs, built robotic rabbit decoys designed to lure snakes into the open, and pioneered something called the Scout Snake Program, fitting radio transmitters onto male pythons and releasing them back into the wild so researchers can follow them straight to breeding females. It is genuinely ingenious wildlife science. One conservation group in southwest Florida alone has removed roughly 20 tons of python since the program began, which sounds enormous until you realize it comes from a couple hundred square miles inside an ecosystem that spans nearly 8,000. Across the full range of removal efforts statewide, tens of thousands of pythons have been taken out since serious tracking began. And the population, by every honest account from the people running these programs, has barely noticed. Somewhere along the way, without much public fanfare, the language quietly shifted from eradication to containment. Nobody in wildlife management believes anymore that Burmese pythons can be removed from the Everglades. The realistic goal now is slowing their spread north before they reach ecosystems that have never had to deal with them. As if that wasn't discouraging enough, researchers discovered a second, quieter problem riding along inside the first one. Burmese pythons carry a lung parasite from Southeast Asia called Raleighiella orientalis, a pentastome worm that pythons themselves tolerate just fine, but that native snakes never evolved defenses against. The parasite spreads through the food chain. Infected pythons shed eggs in their droppings, insects like cockroaches eat the droppings, frogs and lizards eat the insects, and native snakes eat the frogs and lizards. Once inside a native snake, the parasite migrates into the lungs, where it can cause serious respiratory damage. Researchers have now confirmed infections in 18 of Florida's 46 native snake species, found as far away as the Jacksonville area, hundreds of miles from where the outbreak started. And here's the part that worries scientists most: this parasite doesn't need the python anymore. It has already jumped into a self-sustaining cycle through native wildlife. Even in a hypothetical world where every python vanished from Florida overnight, the lungworm would keep spreading on its own power. So that's the landscape this story is really unfolding in. An apex predator nobody can fully remove. A parasite nobody can fully stop. Decades of expensive, high-tech effort producing real but incomplete results. It's the kind of setup where cynicism feels justified. And it's exactly the backdrop against which Florida's plan to release native snakes by the thousands landed like a punchline. The species at the center of it is called the eastern indigo snake, and the reaction when officials announced expanding its reintroduction was almost instantly mocking. People online reached for the same comparison over and over. This is just the mongoose in Hawaii all over again, a predator introduced to fix one problem that ends up causing a completely different one. It's a fair instinct. That comparison exists for a reason, and ecologists take it seriously whenever anyone talks about introducing a new species anywhere. But the eastern indigo isn't a new species being gambled on. It is, and always has been, native to Florida, and to a huge swath of the southeastern United States going back long before European settlement, long before the exotic pet trade, long before Hurricane Andrew. It's the longest native snake in North America, capable of reaching close to 9 feet, with scales that shine an iridescent blue-black in direct sunlight, which is where the name comes from. It's non-venomous, famously calm around humans, and by nearly every account from people who work with them, almost gentle in temperament. But to other snakes, it is an apex predator in the truest sense. Eastern indigos are ophiophagus, meaning snake-eating is a normal, routine part of their diet, and they are remarkably resistant to the venom of the snakes they hunt, including rattlesnakes and cottonmouths. For thousands of years, this species functioned as one of the keystone predators of the longleaf pine ecosystem, helping keep the entire community of reptiles in check. It didn't vanish because of pythons. It vanished because of us, decades before the python problem even began. Habitat loss, road mortality, and heavy overcollection for the pet trade in the 20th century gutted its population so badly that it was federally listed as a threatened species back in 1978. Across much of its historic range in North Florida, it was functionally wiped out. So when the state, working with partners like the Nature Conservancy, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Orion Society, and the Central Florida Zoo's Orion Center for Indigo Conservation, began ramping up releases of captive-bred indigos, it wasn't introducing a foreign weapon into the ecosystem. It was returning a piece that had been missing from the machine for 50 years. This program has been running for close to a decade now, breeding and head-starting young indigos in captivity before releasing them at protected sites like the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Panhandle. As of the most recent releases, more than 500 eastern indigos have gone back into the wild across Florida and Alabama combined, with dozens more added each year. And here is the moment that turns skepticism into something closer to cautious hope. In the fall of 2023, trail cameras at a North Florida preserve captured something nobody had documented in that region in roughly 50 years. 2 tiny indigo hatchlings, born in the wild, not released by any human hand, offspring of previously reintroduced parents that had survived, found each other, and reproduced entirely on their own. It was the first confirmed wild reproduction of eastern indigo snakes in that part of the state in half a century. That single clip, more than any policy document or funding announcement, is what quietly shifted the tone in the rooms where biologists were watching this unfold. It meant the population wasn't just surviving on life support from a hatchery. It was starting to sustain itself. None of this means the python problem is solved, and nobody working on this program is claiming otherwise. Pythons still outnumber every combined removal effort by a staggering margin, and the lungworm parasite is still spreading north on its own, completely indifferent to whatever else is happening in the swamp. Indigos are not being released as some kind of magic bullet designed to hunt pythons down one by one. Adult pythons are simply too large for even a 9-foot indigo to take on. What the science actually shows is more modest and, in its own way, more interesting. A restored native predator base putting pressure back on the smaller end of the food web, competing for territory, disrupting the easy dominance invasive species have enjoyed for decades, and in specific documented cases, directly preying on young pythons before they ever get large enough to become a problem. Add to that the handful of other quiet home team wins researchers have captured on camera in recent years. Bobcats killing adult pythons. Alligators preying on smaller ones. A Florida panther recorded attacking one. None of these are common events yet. But a decade ago, wildlife biologists weren't recording any of them at all. So when you step back from the memes and the easy jokes about repeating history's biggest ecological mistakes, what's actually happening in the Everglades looks less like a repeat of the mongoose story, and more like a slow, deliberate act of ecological repair, running alongside an invasion that nobody has the tools to fully stop. The pythons aren't going anywhere soon. The parasite they brought with them may already be unstoppable. But for the first time in a long time, the native side of that fight has reinforcements, ones that belonged there all along, and ones that are now, on their own, starting to have children in the dark without a single human telling them to. So here's the honest question worth sitting with. If the swamp is capable of quietly reassembling pieces of itself, the returning indigo, the bobcat that's learned it can win, the alligator that's added python to its diet, do you think an ecosystem this damaged can actually find a new equilibrium on its own terms? Or has too much already been lost to ever fully come back? Let me know down in the comments who you think is actually winning this fight right now, the invader, the parasite, or the home team. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around, because nature usually isn't finished telling us what it can do.